When people talk about the Hawker Typhoon, they usually picture a tank buster tearing across Europe, rockets flashing, German armor exploding in flames. It's been celebrated for decades as the Panzer killer, a warbird that ruled the skies. But the truth is a lot less glorious. Within months of victory in Europe, the Royal Air Force was already scrapping Typhoons by the hundreds, eager to move on from an aircraft riddled with deadly flaws. Even its creator, legendary designer Sidney Cam, was criticized for not abandoning the project back in 1941 and focusing instead on the fighter that would replace it, the Tempest. So, was the Typhoon really that bad? In this story, we're digging into the truth and uncovering 11 fatal flaws that nearly ended the Hawker Typhoon before it ever became a legend. Carbon monoxide kills pilots. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came from the men of number, 56 Squadron. Pilots began complaining of pounding headaches, nausea, and dizziness after only a few minutes in the air. Engineers soon realized the unthinkable. The Typhoon was poisoning its own pilots with carbon monoxide leaking from the Saber's exhaust. One tragic case proved it beyond doubt. On November 1st, 1941, Pilot Officer James Deck took off in Typhoon R-7592 on a short test flight. Just 12 minutes later, he crashed and died. Tests found extreme levels of carbon monoxide in his liver. Ironically, Deck had been testing a new, long exhaust modification meant to solve the very problem that killed him. A famous story claims Robert Stanford Tuck was supposed to make that flight but swapped at the last minute because of an urgent call. Years later, evidence didn't match his version. Even the crash site didn't line up. But the real cause was no mystery. Leaking exhaust gases slipped through heated bulkhead seals, and even the gun heating system pumped fumes into the cockpit. Extended exhausts reduced the issue but hurt performance, so Hawker reverted to the short stubs. The final fix was simple but grim. Pilots were ordered to wear their oxygen masks from takeoff to landing. It stopped the deaths, but quietly buried how deadly the Typhoon truly was. The highly unreliable Napier Sabre engine. The Typhoon was born from two competing designs inside Hawker's drawing office. The first, the Type R, was meant to use the Rolls-Royce Vulture engine, later canceled and reborn as the Tornado. The second, the Type N, carried the new Napier Sabre, a 24-cylinder sleeve valve monster rated at roughly 2,200 horsepower. On paper, it looked like the future of British power plants. In practice, it was a mechanical nightmare. The Sabre overheated almost as soon as it left the ground. Oil temperatures spiked within minutes, bearings wore out, and under the wrong conditions, a jammed sleeve valve could blow a cylinder apart in mid-flight. Starting it was just as bad. The Kaufman cartridge starter barely had enough strength to turn the cold engine, and a single misfire could send a sheet of flame roaring from the air intake. Veteran ground crews even used it to prank new pilots, standing them on the wing before hitting start, just to watch them jump when the fire shot past their knees. Engines were rushed from the factory, inconsistently built, and limited to just 25 flight hours before overhaul. That later climbed to 50, then 100 by 1943. Only with the Sabre YIB in 1944, fitted to the Tempest, did Napier finally get it right. For the Typhoon, though, the damage to its reputation was already done. A chaotic supply chain and production line. As if the Sabre's reliability problems weren't enough, Hawker's production system turned into a logistical circus. The Typhoon wasn't even built by Hawker directly. It was assembled under contract by Gloucester Aircraft Company, and Gloucester simply couldn't get enough engines to keep up. Napier's factories were behind schedule, short on skilled labor, and turning out power plants that failed almost as fast as they were fitted. So Gloucester came up with a bizarre workaround. They would borrow one of the few working Sabres, bolt it onto a finished airframe, fly that aircraft to a storage site, then remove the engine and haul it back to the factory to repeat the process on another Typhoon. It was an absurd merry-go-round that left hundreds of brand-new airframes sitting idle. just empty shells waiting for power plants that never arrived. The shortage also crippled pilot training. Squadrons couldn't get enough operational aircraft to qualify new men, and when the engines finally came through, most required a complete overhaul after only a few dozen flight hours. By the end of 1942, the Typhoon program was devouring manpower and money at an alarming rate, burning through resources faster than it ever burned fuel. Thick wings, poor high-altitude performance. One of the Typhoon's biggest weaknesses wasn't in its engine, it was in its wings. When Hawker designed the fighter in the late 1930s, they relied on NACA data from 1938 claiming that laminar flow wings offered no real advantage over traditional airfoil shapes. So, sticking to what they knew, Hawker used a thick Type 22 series wing, similar to the Hurricane's. Sturdy, stable, and easy to build, but anything but sleek. A year later, NACA quietly corrected its findings. Laminar designs dramatically reduced drag at high speeds. The Germans took that new research to heart, applying it to the Focke-Wulf FW-190, which became one of the smoothest, fastest fighters in Europe. The Typhoon, meanwhile, was stuck with a wing that performed beautifully down low, hitting nearly 400 miles per hour at sea level, but lost power and speed rapidly above 18,000 feet. As a result, the Typhoon simply couldn't compete with Spitfires or Messerschmitts in the altitude range where most dogfights happened. Only later, when Sidney Cam reworked the airframe into the Tempest 2 and 5 with a thinner, cleaner laminar flow wing, did Hawker finally correct one of its most expensive design mistakes: poor rear visibility and the car door canopy. For all its brute power, the Typhoon had one fatal flaw that no amount of horsepower could fix. The pilot couldn't see behind him. The entire rear section of the cockpit was covered by solid metal, capped with a thick slab of armor that blocked nearly 160 degrees of rearward vision. Squadron leader Hugh "Cocky" Dundas of No. 609 Squadron summed it up bluntly: "A fighter pilot who can't watch his tail is a dead man." At a meeting on February 10, 1942, Dundas and other pilots pressed the issue before Sidney Cam and Air Ministry officials. Cam reportedly laughed and said, "My airplane is so fast you won't need to look behind you." The room went silent. The Typhoon's so-called car door canopy, complete with side hinges and roll-down windows, rattled in flight, opened against the wind, and made emergency escape almost impossible. Even captured Luftwaffe pilot Oberleutnant Armin Faber, who famously delivered the RAF its first intact FW-190, mocked the Typhoon's design. Why not fit a sliding canopy like ours? When a true bubble canopy was finally tested in January 1943, pilots praised it instantly. But production delays meant most Typhoons didn't receive it until November 1943, and incredibly, many still flying over Normandy in 1944 were stuck with the old car door coffin. Powerful guns, limited ammo, and explosive risks. When it came to firepower, the Typhoon looked fierce on paper, but reality was a little different. Early MKYA prototypes, built during the cannon shortage, were fitted with 12.303 Browning machine guns, good for testing but never used in combat. The later MKIB finally carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons, each one packing a serious punch, but the total load came to only 560 rounds, barely enough for a few bursts. By comparison, an American P-47 Thunderbolt could unleash up to 3,450 rounds of .50 caliber ammo. And then came a far deadlier surprise. Faulty electrical wiring sometimes caused the cannons to explode inside the wings the moment they fired. Canadian pilot Douglas Gordon of No. 440 Squadron, RCAF, described a harrowing mission on July 26, 1944. While diving to attack a ground target, he squeezed the trigger and his right wing blew clean off. Miraculously, he bailed out, badly burned but alive. The entire squadron was grounded until engineers traced the fault. Gordon was even ordered to test fire the repaired guns himself over the English Channel, admitting he was scared stiff the plane would blow again. The defect wasn't widespread, but it was frightening enough to halt operations and remind pilots that the Typhoon could be as dangerous to them as to the enemy. Extremely difficult takeoff, easy to lose control. Even before the Typhoon left the ground, it was already trying to kill its pilot. On the runway, the view straight ahead was completely blocked by that massive Napier Sabre engine, forcing pilots to weave side to side just to see where they were going. And once the throttle went forward, things got truly wild. The Sabre's enormous torque yanked the plane hard to the left, often faster than a new pilot could react. Accidents became routine: burst tires, ground loops, even fatal rollovers. In one tragic case, a blown tire sent a Typhoon skidding into another aircraft, killing one pilot and badly injuring his wingman. It was clear that raw power meant nothing without control. Squadron leader Paul Ritchie of number 609 took charge of fixing it. He issued a simple but life-saving directive: keep the control stick centered during the takeoff roll, don't lift the tail too early, and only ease it back once the plane had built enough speed to stay straight. The order was circulated across all RAF Typhoon units, and for once, it worked. Accidents dropped almost overnight. But even then, every pilot who climbed into a Typhoon knew getting airborne was only half the battle. Failed in the interceptor role. The Typhoon had been built to replace the Hurricane and Spitfire as Britain's next great interceptor, but it never lived up to that promise. By 1942, the Luftwaffe had begun launching low-level FW-190 Jabo raids along England's southern coast, lightning-fast hit-and-run attacks that flew too low for radar to detect. In response, the RAF assigned Typhoons to standing patrols over the Channel, hoping to catch the raiders as they crossed in. It sounded smart on paper, but the results were dismal. The Typhoon burned through fuel, wore out its already fragile engines, and rarely intercepted anything. Within the squadrons, arguments flared. Group Captain Harry Broadhurst wanted to convert the Typhoon into a night fighter, adding radar or pairing it with a spotlight aircraft. Hugh Dundas, on the other hand, argued it should be used as a boom and zoom escort, diving in fast and striking hard. Air Chief Sholto Douglas let Dundas try his idea. The experiment was a disaster. Typhoons never met the enemy but were mistaken for FW-19s and attacked by Spitfires instead. By the end of the trials, the verdict was clear. The Typhoon was simply too heavy, too clumsy, and too unpredictable to be Britain's next interceptor. Mistaken for the FW-190. From a distance, and especially at combat speed, the Typhoon looked almost identical to its worst enemy, the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Both had short, broad wings, a thick fuselage, and a big round nose. To a British pilot, glancing up in the chaos of a dogfight, that silhouette could mean only one thing: enemy. The first deadly mistake came on June 1st, 1942, when two RAF Typhoon pilots, P.O. Duo and Sergeant Stuart Turner, were shot down by friendly Spitfires. Turner was killed. Duo bailed out and survived. Over the next 2 months, more incidents followed, each one a tragic mix-up between allies. Desperate to fix the problem, the RAF tried new paint schemes. Typhoons were given white noses extending back to the cockpit, and later, starting December 5, 1942, black and white stripes under the wings, the same pattern that would later inspire the D-Day invasion stripes. But standardizing those markings across dozens of squadrons proved impossible, and the bright colors made Typhoons easier for Germans to spot instead. For much of 1942 and early 1943, the risk of friendly fire was so high that the Typhoon's combat use was sharply limited. It's hard to think of another fighter whose career was defined so completely by being mistaken for the enemy. Broken tail and structural failure. By the summer of 1942, the Typhoon had developed a terrifying reputation. not just for killing the enemy, but for killing its own pilots in mid-air. On July 29, 1942, Pilot Officer McDonn of No. 257 Squadron died when his Typhoon's tail snapped clean off during a shallow dive. 2 more followed within weeks, including respected test pilot K.F. Smith. Hawker immediately grounded the entire fleet. At first, engineers blamed a weak transport joint, where the tail section met the fuselage. They reinforced it with Modification 286, a fix that added 20 steel plates along the joint. More than 300 airframes were retrofitted, but the crashes continued, proving the theory wrong. The real culprit was a deadly mix of compressibility and pilot reaction. When the Typhoon hit high-speed dives, the controls locked up. Pilots instinctively used elevator trim and throttled back. When airflow returned, the plane suddenly pitched upward so violently that the tail tore off. Test pilot Bill Humble confirmed additional issues with elevator flutter and broken balance brackets, made worse by violent airframe vibration from the Sabre engine's position near the main spar. Fellow tester P.G. Lucas said it shook so badly you couldn't even read the instruments. Only in early 1944, when Typhoons received the stronger Tempest tail unit and redesigned brackets, did those horrifying mid-air breakups finally stop. Radiator and big chin intake, inefficient and extremely dangerous. Of all the Typhoon's deadly quirks, few were as obvious or as dangerous as that huge chin scoop under its nose. Designed to feed air to the radiator, it made the fighter instantly recognizable and instantly vulnerable. In combat, that gaping intake acted like a bullseye for enemy gunners. One burst of machine gun fire into the radiator and the Typhoon's coolant was gone, the engine seizing within seconds. For low-level ground attack missions, it was a glaring weak point. But the real terror came when a Typhoon went down over water. The big scoop worked like a shovel, digging in the moment it touched the surface. Most aircraft flipped violently or sank within seconds, trapping the pilot inside. Even emergency landings on soft fields could end the same way. The scoop bit into the dirt, pitching the airplane onto its back. Veteran Typhoon pilots learned to crack the canopy open before landing, knowing the odds of flipping were high. It was a grim routine, one that made the Typhoon one of the most hazardous aircraft in the RAF to ditch or crash land. Ironically, that same flawed intake design, once refined, became far more efficient on the Typhoon's successor, the sleek and powerful Tempest. In the end, the Typhoon failed at nearly everything it was designed to do. It never became the interceptor or escort fighter the RAF hoped for. But by late 1943, it finally found its purpose as a low-level ground attack and anti-tank aircraft, where brute strength mattered more than finesse. Even so, the famous rocket Typhoon of Normandy was more myth than miracle. Its real effectiveness was far lower than wartime propaganda claimed. What truly deserves respect are the pilots and mechanics who tamed this beast, not the machine itself. Their courage turned a flawed design into a functional weapon, buying time for Hawker to perfect its next masterpiece. Because not every warrior is great, but sometimes from failure comes greatness. The Typhoon failed, so the Tempest could succeed. What do you think? Was it redemption or just luck? Share your thoughts below.